My name is Vivian Caldwell. I am 43 years old, and on the 23rd of November, 2 years ago, I sat at a folding card table in my mother's kitchen. Not at the Thanksgiving dinner table with the rest of my family, but in the kitchen, on a metal folding chair with a cracked rubber foot, with a paper plate and a plastic fork, and a serving of everything that had been passed into the kitchen for me. Because my mother had decided, 3 days before the holiday, that I was no longer welcome at the family meal. She called it a cooling-off period. She used those exact words in a phone call that lasted 9 minutes, which I remember because I was standing at my office window watching the parking lot and I had unconsciously started counting the yellow lines on the pavement while she talked. She said I had embarrassed my younger sister Renee at a birthday dinner 6 weeks earlier. She said I had been difficult and ungrateful, and that Renee deserved to have a peaceful Thanksgiving without tension. So I was told I could still come to the house, because the house was technically a place I had certain rights to come to. A fact that would matter a great deal later. But I would not be seated at the dining room table. I would eat in the kitchen, by myself, while 90 members of my extended family sat in the dining room 20 feet away, doing what families do at Thanksgiving, laughing and reaching over one another for the rolls and arguing about football and telling the same stories they had told for a decade. I sat there with my paper plate. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and roasting meat, and my mother's specific brand of lavender dish soap, which she has used my entire life. I looked at the wall. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not pick up my plate and walk out the door, even though every reasonable instinct I had told me that was the correct thing to do. I just sat there and I looked at the wallpaper border that runs along the top of my mother's kitchen walls, a border she put up in 1997 when she redecorated for the first and only time, and I counted the turkeys on it. There were 41 turkeys on that wallpaper border. I counted them twice to be sure. What they didn't know, what not a single person in that dining room knew, was that I had been quietly paying the mortgage on that house for the previous 22 months. What they didn't know was that 31 days before that Thanksgiving dinner, the mortgage on my parents' home had gone into default. And what they absolutely did not know was that 3 weeks before I sat at that paper plate in that kitchen, I had made a series of decisions, precise, documented, legally sound decisions, that would bring every one of those things into the light. This is that story. But before we go any further, I want to stop for just a moment and ask you something, because I think about this often when I sit down to share something personal. Where in the world are you right now? What part of the earth are you watching or listening to this from, and what time is it there? I genuinely want to know. Drop it in the comments, your city, your country, what time you're tuning in. I love knowing that stories like this one travel. And if this is the kind of story that speaks to you, stories about women who were underestimated, quietly written off, and then quietly, methodically, proven right, please hit the like button and subscribe to Revenge Chronicles. It matters more than you know. Now, let me tell you about the Caldwell family. My parents live, in Westfield, Ohio, a suburb that sits about 40 minutes outside of Columbus. It is the kind of place where the houses have 2-car garages and decorative shutters and lawn service companies that come on Thursdays. The Caldwell house at 14 Birchwood Lane is a colonial with white siding and dark green shutters and a flagstone pathway from the driveway to the front door that my father relaid himself in the summer of 2004 when he decided the old pathway had too many gaps. It took him most of the summer. He measured every stone with a level. My father, Gerald Caldwell, is 68 years old. He spent his working life as a regional manager for a plumbing supply distribution company called Mid-State Supply, which services roughly a third of the plumbing contractors in Central Ohio. He was good at his job. He was organized and fair, and he understood inventory in the way that some people understand music, not just functionally, but intuitively. He retired at 62 with a pension that pays him $2,140 a month, and he has spent the 6 years since then in a gentle, comfortable arrangement where he watches a great deal of football, tends a garden that is considerably more ambitious than his energy level most seasons, and defers to my mother on essentially every family matter without exception or protest. My mother, Patricia Caldwell, is 66. She has not worked outside the home since I was 4 years old. When she left her position as a dental office manager to raise what she expected to be a larger family and what turned out to be 2 daughters, she is formidably organized, socially precise, and has the kind of memory for other people's business that would have made her an exceptional intelligence analyst. Her occupation, as she would describe it with complete sincerity, is managing the family, and she is extraordinarily capable at it. If what you mean by managing is the construction and maintenance of a social hierarchy within the family system, the determination of who is in favor and who is not, and the allocation of credit for family achievements in a way that consistently and comprehensively favors her younger daughter, Renee Caldwell. Renee Harbor now, she kept her married name after her divorce 4 years ago, is 39 years old. She is my younger sister by 4 years, and she has been, in the official language of our family, the golden one. She has been the golden one for as long as I can remember, which means for as long as either of us has been old enough to notice. Renee is beautiful in the particular way that photographs well and commands rooms. Sharp cheekbones, dark hair that has always done exactly what she asks it to do, an instinctive social ease that means she laughs at exactly the right moment and touches your arm at exactly the right moment and makes you feel, when she is focused on you, like you are the most interesting person she has encountered in weeks. She trained as an interior designer at Columbus College of Art and Design, and she opened her own firm, Harbor Interiors, in the Short North neighborhood of Columbus 7 years ago. The startup for that firm came from my parents, $25,000, which is a number I will return to shortly. Renee's firm has done well. Her Instagram account has grown to nearly 22,000 followers. She does residential design primarily, with some commercial work, and her aesthetic runs to warm, layered spaces with vintage and antique elements that photograph beautifully for editorial features. She has been featured in a Columbus lifestyle magazine twice. My mother has framed both articles. They hang in the hallway just past the kitchen, between a family portrait from 2011 and a calendar from a local church. I am an estate attorney. I have been practicing law for 17 years, the last 12 of which I have spent running my own firm, Caldwell Legal, 2 associates, a full-time paralegal named Rhonda, who has been with me for 9 years and knows where everything is. We are based in Bexley, which is a small city adjacent to Columbus with a reputation for good schools and careful residents, which maps well to our client base. I specialize in estate planning and administration, trust law, and the particular subspecialty of navigating what happens to family assets when families have not planned well, which is more common and more emotionally complicated than most people expect. I am not glamorous. I am precise. I am methodical. I am the kind of person who times her Thanksgiving speeches at the kitchen table the night before, and I am not embarrassed to admit it. I have always been better at building things quietly than announcing them loudly. In my family, this has always been treated as a character defect, or more precisely, it has been treated as the reason I am less interesting than Renee, less worthy of attention, less suited to be the face of what the Caldwell family is. The pattern I am about to describe did not begin suddenly. It accumulated, the way most injustices accumulate, in increments small enough to rationalize individually and significant enough to matter in aggregate. The first time I remember it clearly, I was 21 years old and in my second year at Ohio State Law School. Renee was 17 and she had been accepted to a prestigious summer design program in Chicago at a cost of $4,200. My parents told her they could not afford it. Renee cried. Not a dramatic, manipulative cry. I want to be fair to my sister here, but a genuine, disappointed cry from a 17-year-old who had been given an opportunity she could see slipping. I watched this happen on a Sunday afternoon in May in my parents' living room. That night, I called my mother and told her I had $4,200 in savings from part-time legal research work I had been doing through the law school. I told her to take it. She said, "Vivian, we couldn't." I said, "Mom, take it." She did. Renee went to Chicago. She came home at the end of August with a portfolio case and a new vocabulary and stories about the city in a tan. It was a good summer for her. At the family dinner that September, my grandmother asked Renee how the program was, and Renee talked for 20 minutes. No one mentioned how the program had been paid for. I ate my dinner, and I did not bring it up. The second instance that mattered happened when Renee opened her firm. She was 32. My parents told the family they were contributing $25,000 to help her get started. I was happy for her, genuinely happy, because I knew she had real talent and I thought having her own practice would give her the structure she needed. What the family did not know was that my parents did not have $25,000. I knew they did not have it because I had been preparing their tax returns for 8 years at that point, and I knew their finances with the specificity of someone who has read every line of every document. They had equity in the house, they had the pension they were counting on, and some modest retirement savings. They did not have $25,000 in accessible funds. My mother called me in January of that year. She said, "We want to help Renee get started. We don't have the liquid funds." "Could you help?" I said. "How much do you need?" She said, $25,000. I said, "All right." I wrote the check. I wrote it as a loan to my parents, not to Renee, to my parents, and I documented it properly, because I am an estate attorney and I document things properly by professional reflex. I handed my mother the loan agreement along with the check. She signed it and folded it in half and put it in the drawer of the hall table where she puts things she plans to deal with later. For 14 months, a payment of $300 arrived in my bank account on the first of every month. Then it stopped. The loan had a remaining balance of $20,800. 2 years after the payments stopped, I mentioned it in a phone call. Not accusatorially. I mentioned it the way you mention a piece of business that hasn't been resolved. I said, "Mom, there's still a balance on the loan from when Renee opened the firm." She said, "Vivian, family doesn't keep score." I said, "I know. I just want to make sure we're on the same page about where things stand." She said, "We're fine." She ended the call shortly after. I filed that conversation in the part of my memory where I keep things that have no immediate resolution. Now I need to tell you about the house, because it is the center of everything. My parents bought 14 Birchwood Lane in the spring of 1991 for $112,000. Over the following 3 decades, they refinanced twice. Once in 2003 to fund a home renovation that included a new roof, new windows, and the kitchen update with the turkey wallpaper border, and once in 2014 to consolidate some other debt. By the time my father retired in 2016, the remaining mortgage balance was $163,000 at an interest rate of 4.25%, with monthly payments of $940. The house by then was worth somewhere between $310,000 and $340,000, so there was significant equity. But equity is not liquid, and monthly payments are. On my parents' combined income, Gerald's pension at $2,140 and my mother's Social Security at $1,380, the $940 monthly payment consumed about a quarter of everything they brought in. It was manageable. Until it wasn't. In March of 2021, my father had what his cardiologist called a cardiac event. Not a full heart attack. The word the doctors used was significant arrhythmia requiring intervention, and the intervention was an ablation procedure followed by 6 weeks of restricted activity, and a medication regimen that cost my parents, after insurance, roughly $380 a month. The cardiac event also effectively ended my father's ability to do the part-time consulting work he had been doing since retiring, not because he was incapacitated, but because the stress management protocol his doctor prescribed was incompatible with the kind of on-call, deadline-driven consulting he had been doing. That consulting income had been running at about $700 a month, which sounds modest, but when your total household income is $3,500 and your fixed costs are $2,400, $700 is the difference between comfort and difficulty. My mother called me on the 14th of April, 2021. It was a Thursday. She called at 7:22 in the evening, which I noted because I was in the middle of preparing for a deposition the following morning, and I almost didn't pick up. She said, "Things are a little tight right now with your father's health situation. We're figuring it out." I said, "What does a little tight mean, Mom? Walk me through the numbers." She said, "Vivian, we don't need to do that." I said, "I'd like to. Let me help." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I'll send you what I have." She sent it 3 days later. I looked at it for approximately 25 minutes. The picture was clear. With the added medication costs and the lost consulting income, my parents had a monthly shortfall of approximately $630 before any unexpected expenses. Their savings cushion, which I had thought was more substantial, was in fact just over $11,000, enough to cover the shortfall for about 17 months before they were in genuine trouble. The mortgage was the single largest fixed expense, and the one with the most catastrophic consequence, if not met. I called my mother back on the 18th of April. I said, "I'm going to take care of the mortgage payments for the time being, until things stabilize." She said, "Vivian, we can't ask you to do that." I said, "You didn't ask. I offered." She said, "That's very kind of you." "Not thank you. That's very kind of you." I said, "I'll set it up as a direct payment to the servicer. You won't have to think about it." She said, "All right." I called the mortgage servicer that afternoon, provided my payment information, set up an automatic monthly transfer of $940 on the 15th of every month, and confirmed the first payment would post within 72 hours. I told no one, not Renee, who was at that time posting about a new project in Upper Arlington, not my cousin Diane, who lives in Worthington and has always been the family's internal news service, not my Aunt Lorraine, who would have made it a feature story at every family occasion for the next several years. I told no one because I was not doing it to be acknowledged. I was doing it because my parents were going to lose their home if someone didn't, and I was the someone. For 22 months, the transfer went through on the 15th of every month like a small, reliable tide. In those same 22 months, I watched my sister Renee travel to Portugal for 10 days in the summer of 2022. With 2 of her friends from design school, she documented the trip across 4 separate Instagram posts that collectively received thousands of likes. I watched her redecorate her apartment in German Village, which she also documented in detail, including a vintage Moroccan rug she sourced from an antique fair in Granville, and a pair of custom linen drapes. I watched her post a photograph of herself standing next to a white BMW 3 Series that she had just purchased, and I watched my mother forward me that photograph with the message, "Isn't she something?" I stared at the message for a long time. Then I put my phone face down on the desk and went back to the trust document I had been drafting. I need to tell you about the birthday dinner because it is what precipitated the Thanksgiving exile, and because the story of what actually happened at that dinner is so different from the version my family had accepted as fact that it still catches me off guard when I think about it. Renee turned 39 in early October 2 years ago. She organized a birthday dinner at a restaurant in the Clintonville neighborhood of Columbus called Harvest Moon, a farm-to-table place with exposed brick, and a very good wine program. There were 8 of us at the table: Renee, me, 3 of Renee's friends from design school, including a woman named Becca Truman, Renee's business partner Maya, and 2 women I had not met before who were friends from her gym. The dinner started well. The food was excellent. I had the halibut. Conversation moved around the table in the way it does at birthday dinners, loosely, overlapping. Sometime around 8:30 in the evening, when we were on our second bottle of wine and the entrees had been cleared, Becca Truman turned to me and said, "Renee told me you're an estate attorney." I said I was. Becca said, "I'm actually dealing with something related to that right now. My grandmother passed away in August and I was named executor of her estate. Honestly, I'm completely lost." She laughed the way people laugh when they feel genuinely overwhelmed. She said, "Is it as complicated as I think it is?" I said, "It depends on the estate. What are you dealing with?" Becca explained. Her grandmother had a home in Gahanna, some investment accounts, and a contested piece of property involving a cousin who claimed a verbal agreement gave him ownership of a parcel of land. She said the probate court had been confusing. and that she felt like she didn't understand what the timeline was or what she was supposed to be doing. I walked her through it. I told her Ohio probate typically runs between 6 and 18 months depending on complexity. I told her that verbal agreements regarding real property almost never hold up because of the statute of frauds, and that if the cousin was planning to contest, he would need documented evidence. I told her she needed to get a professional appraisal on the home and the land before anything else, and that she should consider consulting an estate attorney, not just for the probate process, but to protect herself as executor from liability if the estate was challenged. I gave her the name of a colleague in Columbus who handles contested estates and told her to call him on Monday. Becca said, "Oh my God, this is so helpful. Thank you." She wrote down my colleague's name. Renee smiled at me from across the table. That was the exchange. It lasted approximately 12 minutes by my recollection, though I was not timing it. The other 6 people at the table were engaged in their own conversation and glanced over occasionally. No one appeared uncomfortable. The dinner continued. Dessert was ordered. At the end of the evening, I asked the server for the check because it was Renee's birthday and I wanted to pay for the table. The bill came to $312, including tip. I paid it. I hugged Renee goodnight. I drove home. 2 days later, Renee called me. She said, "I need to say something to you about the other night." I said, "All right." She said, "You completely hijacked my birthday dinner to give Becca a legal consultation. You talked for almost half an hour about yourself and your work, and you made everyone uncomfortable." I said, "Renee." She asked me a question. I answered it. Renee said, "You lectured her, Vivian, for 30 minutes. It's what you do. You can't help yourself. You have to be the expert in every room." I said she was upset about her grandmother's estate. I gave her information that was useful. Renee said, "You made it about you. This is why people find you exhausting." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "Happy birthday, Renee. I'm glad you had a nice evening." And I ended the call. 5 days after that, my mother called. She had by then heard Renee's version of events. She said, "I've been talking to Renee, and I think you need to apologize to her, Vivian. What you did at her birthday dinner was thoughtless." I said, "I answered a question that someone asked me, Mom." She said, "You dominated the conversation at your sister's birthday dinner to talk about your career." I said, "That is not what happened." She said, "Renee was very hurt." I said, "I understand she was upset. I disagree with her account of what happened. My mother said, 'You never think you've done anything wrong. That is your problem. That has always been your problem.'" Then, she told me about the cooling off period. She told me I could come to Thanksgiving but not sit at the table. I said, "All right, Mom." And I went back to work. If you are still watching right now, I want you to stay with me, because the next part of the story is the part that I have thought about every single day since it happened, and I want to get it exactly right. If this story is reaching you, if you have ever been the one who quietly holds everything together while someone else receives the credit, if you have ever been excluded from the table by the very people you have been quietly carrying, please subscribe to this channel right now. Leave a comment. Tell me where you are in this story. You are not alone in it. Every comment you leave helps other women who need to hear this find their way here. On the 14th of October, 2 years ago, I was at my desk at Caldwell Legal, working on an estate administration for a client in Pickerington, when I logged into my parents' mortgage account to do my twice-yearly review. I had not told my parents I did this. I did it for the same reason I do most financial oversight in my professional and personal life. Because I have watched enough estates dissolve and enough families lose things to know that absence of attention is its own kind of action. The account showed a past due balance of $2,820. The account status read, "Initial default notice issued." There was a notice from the servicer dated the 2nd of October indicating that the account had failed to receive 3 consecutive monthly payments, and that if the delinquency was not resolved within 45 days, the servicer would begin formal foreclosure proceedings. I sat very still, I am a person who sits very still when information arrives that requires serious processing. I read the notice 3 times. Then I checked my own bank records and confirmed that my automatic transfers had gone out on the 15th of July, the 15th of August, and the 15th of September, all in the amount of $940. They'd gone out. They'd not been applied. I called the servicer from my office phone. I spent 37 minutes on hold and then spoke with a representative named Marcus who walked me through what had happened. In July, my parents had called the servicer and requested that the payment arrangement be changed. They had told the servicer they wanted the payments to come from their own account going forward. The servicer had updated the authorization records. My transfers had continued to go out on the 15th, but were now routing into a holding account rather than being applied, because the account had been updated to reflect a different primary payer. My parents had apparently not followed through on setting up their own replacement payments, or had set them up and then stopped, because 3 months later the account was 3 payments behind. I thanked Marcus. I hung up. I looked out my office window for about 4 minutes. Then I called my mother. I said, "Mom, the mortgage is in default, 3 payments behind." "Did you know this?" She said, "We've been aware there was some confusion." I said, "It is not confusion, Mom. There is a formal default notice. 45 days until they begin foreclosure." She said, "Gerald has been dealing with it." I said, "I need to speak with Gerald." She said he was resting. I said, "Please have him call me when he's up." He did not call that day. He did not call the following day. On the 3rd day I called back. My father answered. I said, "Dad, I need to talk to you about the mortgage." He said, "Vivian, we're going to refinance." I said, "Have you spoken with any lenders?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Renee's looking into some options for us." I absorbed this. Renee, who has a design firm and an Instagram following and a white BMW, was looking into mortgage refinancing options for a couple in their late 60s with the defaulted loan. I said, "Okay, Dad, keep me posted," and I hung up. Over the next 10 days, I monitored the account. No payment was made. I called a contact of mine at a regional mortgage company, Sandra Pruitt, with whom I had worked on 3 estate matters involving real property and who I trusted completely, and I asked her hypothetically what the options were for homeowners in my parents' situation. She was direct and thorough. At their income level and age, a standard refinance would be difficult without significant equity, which they had, but the default status would complicate the application. The default would need to be cured before any refinancing could proceed. Sandra said if someone could cure the default and bring the account current, the refinancing conversation became straightforward. If not, they were looking at an accelerating foreclosure timeline. I spent 3 evenings reviewing every document I had related to my parents' financial history. I reviewed the original loan agreement from the Chicago summer program. I reviewed the loan documentation from Renee's firm startup, the agreement my mother had signed and placed in the hall table drawer. I reviewed 22 months of payment confirmations for the mortgage transfers. I pulled my parents' most recent tax returns, which I had prepared. I reviewed the mortgage statements from the past 3 years. Then I spent 2 evenings drafting documents. The first was the cure payment authorization. The amount was $2,820, representing 3 months at $940 per month. I submitted it on the 1st of November. The servicer confirmed receipt and application within 48 hours. The account status updated to current. The second document was a consolidated loan agreement. I had my paralegal Rhonda prepare it on legal letterhead. It itemized every sum I had extended to my family over the years that had not been repaid, the $4,200 from the Chicago summer program, the $20,800 remaining from the firm's startup loan, the 22 months of mortgage payments totaling $20,680, the $2,820 to cure the default. The total was $48,500. I sat with that number for a long time. Then I printed 2 copies, signed them, and placed them in a manila folder in my briefcase. I then called my cousin Diane. Diane Pendleton is 47 years old and has lived in Worthington for the past 12 years. She is married to a man named Keith who works in insurance, and she has 2 teenagers and a very organized schedule, and a social intelligence that, in different circumstances, she might have used to run a small country. Diane loves our family with the specific intensity of someone who has chosen to remain deeply embedded in it despite having enough self-awareness to see it clearly. She and I have always had an understanding, a mutual respect grounded in the fact that we are both, fundamentally, people who pay attention. I called Diane on the 3rd of November. I told her I needed something from her and that it mattered. I said, I need everyone at Mom and Dad's for Thanksgiving. The whole group, all of them. Aunt Lorraine, Uncle Phil, the Dayton cousins, the Warfields from next door, everyone. Diane said, is everything okay? I said, there's something I need to address with the family, and I need everyone present. Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'll make it happen. I said, thank you. She said, Vivian. I said, yes. She said, whatever this is, good. I said, I appreciate that. Diane. I spent the next 3 weeks doing exactly what I always do, working. I finished 2 estate administrations, filed paperwork in Franklin County, had 2 consultations with new clients, and submitted the refinancing inquiry to Sandra Pruitt on behalf of my parents. Sandra confirmed that with the account cured and current, the refinancing was achievable. She prepared a preliminary term sheet. I made one additional preparation. I printed the mortgage account history, 22 months of payment records, along with the default notice, the cure payment confirmation, and the updated account status. I baked a pecan pie on the evening of the 22nd of November from scratch, and on the morning of the 23rd, I put on a dark green wool blazer and gray trousers, and I drove 40 minutes to Westfield with 2 bottles of wine and a pecan pie and a briefcase. My mother met me at the door at 2:45 in the afternoon. She looked at the wine and the pie. She said, you can put those in the kitchen. You know where you're sitting. I said, of course. I set the pie down. I poured myself a glass of wine. I sat at the folding table. I counted the turkeys. 41. The meal in the dining room was everything it always was. I could hear Aunt Lorraine's laugh. I could hear Uncle Phil making his annual case for his wife's stuffing. I could hear Renee telling a story about a difficult client. She told it well. She always tells stories well. At 4:17 in the afternoon, I walked to the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room and stood there until the room noticed me. I said, I'm sorry to interrupt. I need a few minutes with the family. Something has come up that everyone should be aware of. My mother said, Vivian, we're in the middle of dinner. I said, I know. I'll be brief. Renee said, Mom, let her talk. I said, thank you. And then I began. I spoke for 11 minutes. I had timed it the night before. I told them that the house they were sitting in had been 31 days from formal foreclosure proceedings as of 6 weeks ago. I told them I had been paying the mortgage for 22 months and had cured the default 3 weeks prior. I placed the mortgage statement on the table, the one showing the delinquency and the cure payment bearing my name. I placed Sandra Pruitt's refinancing term sheet on the table. Then I placed the consolidated loan agreement, $48,500, itemized, documented, signed. I said that I was not demanding immediate repayment. I was asking for acknowledgement, legal, documented acknowledgement, that these amounts existed and that there was a plan. I said, I am asking for this because 3 weeks ago I sat in the kitchen of this house at a paper plate because I answered a question at a birthday dinner. And the people who sent me to that kitchen had no idea I had been making sure they still had a house to sit in. The room went very quiet. My Uncle Phil set down his fork. He said, Patricia, how much of this did you know? My mother looked at the tablecloth. Renee said, very quietly, Mom, did you know the mortgage was in default? My mother said, we were in the process of addressing it. My father said, Vivian. He said it the way parents say a child's name when they have been caught at something they are genuinely ashamed of. He looked at the folder on the table. He said, we should have called you back. Diane, seated at the near corner of the table, said, I think we should give this a minute to land. Renee stood up from her chair. She walked around the table and came to stand beside me in the doorway. She looked at me directly, the way she had not looked at me in years, and she said, You paid the mortgage for 22 months. I said, yes. She said, why didn't you tell us? I said, because no one asked. There was silence again. Aunt Lorraine said, Patricia, I think you owe your daughter an apology. My mother opened her mouth. She looked at the tablecloth. She said, I didn't know all of this. Renee said to me, come sit down. Come sit at the table. I looked at her for a moment. Then I nodded. I went to the kitchen and I retrieved my paper plate and my glass of wine and I carried them back. Someone slid over to make room. Someone found me a real plate. The pecan pie came out. Conversation resumed, slowly at first, and then more fully, the way it does when something significant has shifted and people are deciding how to carry it. My mother did not say anything directly to me for the remainder of the meal. But before I left that evening, she found me in the hallway where I was putting on my coat. She said my name. I waited. She said, I didn't realize how serious the mortgage situation had become. I said, I know, Mom. She said, you should have told us sooner. I said, you should have asked. She was quiet. Then she said, I'm sorry you felt left out. I noticed the phrasing, sorry you felt. Not sorry, I made you feel, and I noticed it with the precision of someone who has spent a career reading language for what it means. But it was costing her something, and I decided that this version was enough for today. I hugged her. I meant it. I am not a woman who withholds warmth as a tactic. I hugged her and I picked up my briefcase and I drove home. In the weeks that followed, my parents signed the refinancing paperwork with Sandra Pruitt. The loan consolidation agreement required more time. There were family conversations, some uncomfortable. A family financial session that Diane organized with her characteristic efficiency, where 5 of us sat at my parents' dining room table with the document and worked through it line by line. The document was eventually signed in January. Renee and I have had several long phone calls since November. In one of them, she said, I think I made myself the victim of everything because it was easier than looking at what was actually happening. You were the one doing things. I was the one being celebrated for things I didn't do alone. She said, I'm sorry for the birthday dinner conversation. I was jealous of how Becca looked at you, how everyone always eventually turns to you for the real information. And I turned that into something about you being difficult. She said, that wasn't fair. That was the most honest sentence my sister has ever said to me. I told her so. She laughed and said, don't make it weird, which is very Renee. I appreciated it. My father called me on a Sunday morning in early February at 9:14 in the morning. He said, I've been thinking about what happened at Thanksgiving. I said, what about it? He said, I think we assumed you would always just be there, that you didn't need to be thanked or asked or included because you were just part of the furniture, and that was wrong. You are not the furniture. I said, no, Dad, I'm not. He said, I'm going to do better. I said, I know you will. That phone call, more than the dinner, more than the signed documents, is the one I think I will carry with me for a long time. I want to speak directly to you now, if you will allow me. If you are the person in your family who has been the mortgage and the startup money and the late-night phone call and the answer when things fell apart, and who has also been the person seated at the paper plate, excluded from the table you have been quietly funding, I want you to hear this clearly. Silence is not the same as absence. Patience is not the same as passivity. And the fact that no one is watching does not mean that nothing is being built. Everything you have carried, every sacrifice that was accepted without acknowledgement, every loan that became a gift by default, it was real. It happened. It has weight. The fact that the people who benefited from it did not see it does not mean it did not exist. I did not plan that Thanksgiving speech as revenge. I planned it as visibility. I was tired. And tired is the right word, not a dramatic one. I was tired of being invisible in the lives of people I had made possible. I did not want to punish them. I wanted them to see what they had been standing on, so they would know it was there. So they would know I was there. There is a version of power that announces itself loudly, and there is another version that builds quietly, in legal files and automatic transfers and timed remarks at a folding table, and then one day it simply becomes visible. That version is slower. It is less satisfying in the moment, and it tends, in my experience, to be the kind that lasts. What I understand now, at 43, is that you cannot make people value what they have decided not to see. You can only decide how long you are willing to operate inside the version of reality where you do not exist. You can only decide when it is time to become visible, not for revenge and not for credit, but because the truth has its own quiet authority, and when it is spoken clearly and calmly and with documentation on the table, it tends to land. I am still the estate attorney in Bexley. I still have my firm, my 2 associates, my paralegal Rhonda. I still do my parents' taxes. I still transfer $940 on the 15th of every month, and I have chosen to continue doing it. Not because I am obligated to, but because choosing it changes what it means. It is no longer invisible. It is now a conscious act, made by a person who is fully seen. My question for you today, the one I want you to carry into your own week, is this: have you ever quietly held something together for people who didn't know you were holding it? And when the moment finally came to be seen, did you let it happen? Or did you stay small? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one, and your words matter to this community more than you know. To everyone watching today, whether this is your first story with us or your 50th, I want to say something that I mean without formality. Thank you. Not just for the watch time or the subscribe or the comment, though all of those things genuinely help this channel reach more women who need to hear stories like this one. But thank you for caring about these stories, for showing up for them, for recognizing something true in them and staying with it. Every day, this team wakes up and builds this channel, because we believe that the women who hold things together deserve to be seen, in their families, in their communities, in the places where their labor has been invisible. You are part of why that work continues. Subscribe if you haven't. Come back tomorrow. We will be here. And the quietest comeback you will ever witness is always the one that was built in the longest silence.